Hello, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending from where you are joining us. I am Magda Tedder, and I'm the Literature and Judaic Studies at Fordham and the co-director of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome you today for our webinar discussing a film by Richard Kroehling, After Poetry Destroys Silence, which we're screening virtually for those of you who have registered for our program. The film juxtaposes two competing claims about poetry after genocide and unspeakable horrors. Theodor Adorno's statement, "To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric," and Charles Bukowski's rebuttal, "Poetry is what happens when nothing else can." And we're really honored to have with us the film's director, Richard Kroehling, who is a multidisciplinary artist, film director, multimedia maker, painter, and a poet himself. Kroehling studied with iconic Hollywood director Nick Ray and avant-garde Austrian cinema artist Peter Kubelka, and his work include feature films, mainstream television, nonfiction, video art, photography, poetry, and installation media art. Richard Kroehling's works have been shown at film festivals and exhibited at art museums and galleries around the world, including the MoMA, the Jewish Museum in New York, Brooklyn Museum, Cinema Gaumont in Paris, Kunsthalle in Copenhagen, Göteborg Kunsthalle, and other places. We're also joined today by two very distinguished scholars of poetry and memory and trauma. Amelia Glaser, who holds a chair in Judaic Studies at the University of California in San Diego, and her scholarship examines the intersection of Slavic and Jewish literatures from the 19th century to present, as well as the poetics of leftist internationalism. She is the author of Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's literary Borderlands, which was published in 2012, Songs in the Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry and of Struggles from Scottsboro to Palestine. And she also edited two books, Stories of Khmelnytsky, Competing Literary Legacies of the 1648 Ukrainian Cossack Uprising, and with Stephen Lee, Comintern Aesthetics. She is also a translator, including a translator of poetry. Her translations are Prolet Pen, America's Rebel Yiddish Poets, and recently with Yulia Ilchuk, Halina's Crook, a crash course in Molotov cocktails. She has received many awards, and including for this last book, and many international and national fellowships, such as, for instance, the Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard. She is the curator of Contemporary Ukrainian Poetry Archive, ukrapoetry.org, and is currently at work on a book about Ukrainian poetry. And the second distinguished scholar is Anna Shternshis, who is the J. Richard and Dorothy Schiff Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. She's a distinguished scholar of Soviet Jewish culture, oral history, as well as Yiddish music, and is the author of Soviet and Kosher, Jewish Popular Culture in the Soviet Union, which came out in 2006, and a more recent book, When Sonia Met Boris, An Oral History of Jewish Life Under Stalin. And her recent project, Yiddish Glory, The Lost Songs of World War II, which highlights forgotten Yiddish music written during the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, has received a widespread acclaim, including a Grammy nomination in 2019. Anna has received several awards and distinguished fellowships, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. So I'm really very honored that we have you with us. And without further ado, I think we should start our conversation. So let's get this going.
Great. Thank you, Magda, and again, thanks everybody for being here. Just as a way to start this conversation, I wanted to ask Richard a question that can be then opened up to the other panelists, and it's a question about the statement that Magda cited, the statement by Adorno, whose resonance I think seems to run throughout the movie. That statement, which is very often quoted about the possibility of writing poetry after Auschwitz. The full quote is actually as follows: "The critical culture is confronted with the last stage in the dialectical culture and barbarism. To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric, and that corrodes also the knowledge which expresses why it has become impossible to write poetry today." Adorno partially retracted it in 1966 in Negative Dialectics, saying it might have been wrong to say that no more poetry could be written after Auschwitz. And in 1967, he wrote in Without Motto, quote, "While the situation no longer permits art," this was the point of the statement about the impossibility of poetry after Auschwitz, "it nevertheless requires it," end of quote. And then he kept elaborating on it in multiple writings and interviews. So my question for you, Richard, is what significance this quote in its multiple permutations and iteration has had for you, and why it has seemingly become so central to the project of this movie?
Do you have 5 hours? um, well, I never even intended it really to be in the film. And of course, it is the most widely known quote about art making and trauma and horror. And I often think, what's the role of art in the world, and does it really do anything? Does it really uh, help at all? So I think during some of the film, it was brought up. And so in casual, very light conversation during my conversation with some of the poets, we just started to banter back and forth. Uh, what's the role of an artist? Does an artist bury one's head in the sand, or do you do something? Do you actually keep creating something in the light of all of this horror, this trauma? Or do you just say, "I'm sorry, I can't do it"? On further reading, and I can't go there today. It's Adorno's work is pretty involved, and that quote is part of a 3 or 4 page little thing, and he didn't exactly mean that, like, just don't go there. He meant that, like you're saying, he's positioning uh, writing after horror, and how does one even begin to find words uh, or make any equivalence. So my answer is, it's something that popped up. It's something that in a 90-minute compression, which a film is, it's not a 400-page book about the nature of art and all of that. It's just something that got the poets, especially Elisa Ostreicher and Ed Hirsch, both talk about that in the film. And the fact that, I mean, they rejected the misinterpretation of the line as just, for them, as that's what an artist does. I mean, that's what art does. It faces off it comes face to face with the inexpressible, with the intolerable, with the horrors of the world. That's what creativity does, or what's the point? So what I'm saying in a very simple way is, we found ourselves playing with that line. I didn't expect it. I didn't really want it. It wasn't part of the design of the film. And I think for a mass audience, trying to deal with, the sophistication of language and imagery, I think this kind of thing helped position why the film has some value and why poetry has value in the world. I mean, it's really difficult for me to talk about his line, because that's not exactly what he meant, and that's that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I wonder, opening this also up to Amelia and Anna, whether there is any particular way in which this prescription or this inhibition works for Jewish poetry, more specifically, or for poetry by Jewish authors, as opposed to more broadly for poetic production. But feel free to just respond to me.
I've always read the Adorno quote as a kind of challenge, right? Can we still communicate and receive art as such, as something that can be dressed up and packaged after the unthinkable has happened? I, as a scholar of poetry and also as a translator of poetry, I view poetry as the genre perhaps that's the most deeply bound up in all of our relationships to communication. It's a genre that tests our flexibility with our own languages, and it tests what is created when we put pressure on those languages. So, all of these poets that are featured in the film, including those who are no longer with us, are poets who have attempted to make something with language after a really horrific experience, and perhaps after the experience of losing an idealized world, even an idealized, idea of God, right? This, Paul Celan poem Todesfuge that is cited here at length in German in the film is, very much a sort of send up of art. Right? It initiated as a tango, and then he shifted it toward a fugue, and it became this death fugue, which is, here we go, let's do art with death. But Paul Celan also did things like, there's a wonderful poem where he takes he calls it psalm, and he takes just a blessing, a prayer, and he takes out God and he puts in Niman, or no one, right? Blessed art thou, O no one. So he's taking language and he's allowing language to sit with us in this empty void.
So I agree with a lot of that. And I always thought about that Adorno's quote as a quote of someone who looks at the violence from a distance as opposed from within. A lot of poems, including the ones in the film by Stalin and some others, were written in the midst of violence as opposed to looking from a distance. And it matters a lot because those of us who study the relationship between wars and art, wars and poetry, we know that as soon as the military conflict erupts, some of the first human reactions to that conflict come in the forms of poetry. In other words, people often don't have time to write down diaries or even put coherent, essays or even statements together. But poetry somehow is much more acute and reacts to violence in a much better way. Sometimes people use existing poems to adjust them a little bit to the violence that's happening, to describe their feelings and their emotions and whatever is happening around them. Sometimes it's new stuff. But the point is, historians who study conflict know that if we want to know what people thought in that moment right now, they have to go to poetry first. So the statement, you can't write poetry after Auschwitz, can only be said, even in a challenging way, by someone who was not in the midst of all that. And I agree also with Amelia and Richard earlier that it is a challenge. It is an interesting thing to talk about. And it's also an interesting way to frame this really important film that shows, well, look at all this art and all these poets and all these emotions that are documented and expressed through poetry after Auschwitz. Also in the film, I can't remember, one of the featured speakers said, well, we're writing poetry after Celan and after others, and it matters. And I felt like this was such a profound response to the quote at the beginning. Of course it matters. You have to think about who wrote and what they wrote in the midst of the experience, and then you think about that tradition, develop that tradition, and make sure that silence does not swallow that tradition. So I think the film did a really good job kind of pushing that idea, expressing that idea beautifully, and address that quote in a way that made a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
I mean,
Yeah.
Hirsch mentioned, I mean, what's the job of poetry? I mean, I agree with you, Anna. If it doesn't address these issues, I mean, what does, there's so much art now in painting and that's so just meaningless and decorative. And here we are on the hinge of history. We don't know what's going to happen 3 months from now. Here comes AI, here comes global warming, here comes totalitarian governments all over the world. What's going on? What a perfect storm of the apocalypse. But what's the job of poetry if it's not to find new meanings? I mean, poetry isn't utilitarian language. It's language that's broken, that's like Paul Celan restructured to find new meanings, to reconcile like deep and profound tragic events. And it's that, to me, art making and poetry is something that allows humanity. I mean, that might sound a little profound, but or not profound, to climb the sort of Jacob's ladder of our cultural evolution. It's one of the positive things that lets us climb the ladder versus all the things that are pulling us backward down the ladder. So to me, someone once I heard made an interesting thing about art, and I think it works for poetry and cinema. If you remember the old cowboy movies in the 50s and the 40s, where the wagon train was out west, and they didn't know whether they could go up further without getting killed by, the indigenous tribes, the dangerous Apaches or whatever. And they would send 2 Apache guides up ahead to see if it was safe to go, to keep the wagon train moving westward. I know it's a Hollywood cliche, but that poetry, I think, does a little bit of that. It creates new meanings, new states, to see if we can in some way find a progressive understanding, never a resolution, but trying to gain some foothold. Of course, I reject the idea that one can find any kind of meaning in mass murder and genocide, but I think it's a necessary human thing, because if not, we're left with reportage, just journalism, and that doesn't take you very far. I mean, it's very important. Facts are very important. So are opinions, but more than that, we need to find a new interior landscape. To me, I don't know if that makes any sense. That to me is what is interesting about cinema and interesting about advanced language, is because it puts an audience and me into what I call the poised realm. It's a realm outside of the mechanistic language realm. I guess the best word for that would be indeterminacy, an indeterminate realm where we have to participate to figure out what happened and what that might mean. That's what art does to me, and the best poetry. I mean, think Celan's life. I mean, my God. And so he's writing in German after this. He goes to Heidegger, who's speaking at a college thing in Heidelberg, I believe. And Heidegger comes down to watch his poem being read. Of course, he doesn't understand Celan at all. And he goes back to his little mountain hut, his little German mountain hut. And of course, Celan, who loved Heidegger on some level, goes back up there after reading the poem that's in the film, expecting some kind of conversation, maybe even some kind of apology for Heidegger's very clear Nazism or something, and drives away. Boy, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. He drives away with the driver, and there were some fragments that were recorded. Celan was dead in 2 or 3 weeks after that, suicide, because Heidegger never responded at all. Anyhow, I'm getting off
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think both Emmanuel and I had the question about what you were just talking about, the kind of the function and the Ed Hirsch talks about the obligation of poetry, and the language is very harsh from the statement of poetry be sort of bringing up feelings and connecting, and yet the language of obligation, of what we ask of poetry. So we were wondering what your thoughts are on, does poetry have obligations, and for whom? And Emmanuel had also some thoughts on and comments on that. Emmanuel.
Yeah, I guess another piece to add to the question would be perhaps what sort of loss of freedom is entailed by the position of ethical or political demands on poetry itself. You were saying poetry, the language of poetry, poetical language, is not utilitarian, and so I was wondering if even the kind of good kind of utilitarianism, or the utilitarianism that would be in the service of good politics or progressive politics, might still impose constraints on poetic language that would prevent it from actually taking us to that zone of indeterminacy from which a greater, more radical opening could arise.
Yeah, well, to me, there's that fine line in all art where it becomes where the art kind of drops into a kind of advanced form of journalism. It's kind of polemical, and it loses a lot of that poetic gas energy. I mean, I just thought of Bob Dylan as a new song over the last year or two, where, earlier in his career, of course, he wrote all of that political stuff of the 60s, but he wrote an incredible piece called Murder Most Foul, which was about the Kennedy assassination. And it goes on, and it's about that day in Dallas and about the beginning of the ends of this empire. And it's the most poetic thing I've heard. So what I'm saying is his skillfulness allowed him to take a dip into that very political world and do it so artfully that I don't feel that poem suffered at all. I mean, he used various techniques, which I won't get off the topic on, but yeah, you're right. There could be a limiting of poetic devices if one has to make very specific political points, but that's up to the poet to figure that out and how to do that well. I mean, I think artists have a responsibility to engage in the real facts of the world, like Brecht would say, or else you're just making decorative paintings for behind a sofa, a green painting behind a green sofa. I mean, that sounds pretty harsh on my point, and I know a lot of abstract expressionists wouldn't like what I just said, but I think, especially in the world, I mean, Ed Hirsch in the film makes a really radical comment about the responsibility and the scope of poetry. He says, hey, if poetry can't bring the dead back to life, then what good is it? I mean, it's an absurd comment on some level.
Amelia, Anna?
I mean, it's incredibly important. And, I mean, we have no life or love of anything for poetry. I mean, I understand in the former Soviet Union, they would fill up, stadiums with poets reading.
Mm-hmm.
Good old days, huh? Yeah. Yeah. I think bring back dead to life is high order, is hard, but letting people feel human when the circumstances around them don't allow for such things, that is something that poetry can do. I was thinking, and I know Amelia knows a lot more about this than I do, so I'll just say one thing. Like, the film ends with 2015, and I think, right? And after that, we have so many more fresh wars that are covered and are in our mind. And, um, you know, I was just for the past few years following very closely what's happening in Ukraine and how they're reacting to things. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues in Mariupol who said, if you can crack, like at the middle of the night and there's shelling and we have to leave the house and stand by the bonfire to wait for to be allowed to go in, and the electricity goes down and it's cold, so they make this bonfire. And then she says, like, if somebody cracks a good joke or tells a good poem, in that situation, that person becomes a hero for months, because an ability to, I don't know, release the tension, to make people feel like a community, and some people might say distract them from that violence, and from immediate danger, that is worth more than gold. So in that sense, maybe that's the meaning of bringing dead to life. But I think an ability to make people feel like a community, like humans again, that is something that poetry can do. But I don't want to talk too much about this, because I think Amelia has more concrete examples, and maybe examples of poetry itself from that context.
Well, I was thinking a lot about contemporary wars as I was watching this. I mean, it's a film about war and poetry. There's one specific example of the Holocaust in poetry and the way that people have continued to think about going back. And here we are at, soon will be 100 years, right, since the rise of Hitler in just a few years. And it's a test case, right? Is this, are the remnants in film and poetry and art enough to still horrify people? Because poetry can obviously be, as Anna was saying, it can be a document of the moment, right? Someone can write something down very quickly, and it can be a document not only of what is happening, right? Physically, there is a bomb that's falling right now, or, here is how I'm feeling, and I'm going to try to sum this up so that this moment won't be forgotten by someone if it's read. And, I was thinking about contemporary wars and what poets are doing now, and it's different because the media have changed. I know poets who will actually compose poetry into their Facebook accounts in Ukraine, partly because it's just easy. They're so used to writing on their phone into their Facebook accounts to give updates of the war that's how their poetry will happen. And then they'll go back and they can always edit it later. But they're also getting instant responses from their readers, and they know that it wasn't just a voice in the dark. Whereas someone writing something down on a scrap of paper and putting it in their pocket doesn't necessarily know when someone will read that. So we have different ways that poetry circulates today, which is also a kind of an interesting thing. But your film is also talking about later poets that are continuing to write about the Holocaust now, that do have access to these same circulatory means. And I don't know if now is a good time. I was actually going to share a poem that I translated yesterday, because it struck me that it resonated with some of these poems, especially the Ceylon poem, but also the Amichai bit. Would now be a good moment to share that poem from the Ukraine war. And this is a poem by Yarina Chornohuz. I'm sharing it with her permission. She is fighting on the front right now. Really remarkable poet who joined the army before the full-scale invasion, despite having a very young child, and goes back and forth to Kyiv to be with her daughter, and to the front where she's working as a medic. And it's called I'll just read it. It's called The Girl from Pivnichne, but it's a poem about documenting and about kind of remembering and how to do justice to something that's much larger scale than any snapshot or poem can actually capture. And with apologies for my, it's still a draft. Summer, where the cracked roads bend, shrouds autumn's uncounted leaves, then ends. The road repaired from tanks and blast holes ends, but not the life of the girl from Pivnichne. The girl walks her bike along the Pivnichny road that curves at an angle, and her pink clothes look more serious than camouflage, deadlier than a submunition mine left by a cluster shell. How many of you have died in the world's silence? War's familiarity is like the creak of swings in the shelter yards of villages. War's familiarity is like a poem without images. No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten is nothing but a slogan in the world's silence. And the chain on the swing near the front line creaks, and no one notices war's familiarity. How can I keep you here in the world's silence when only one of every 1,000 living lives on forever for 1,000 dead? How can I hold on to you when the lives of the living will end, even those of you who survived and those who killed in the name of life? Who will collect the debts on your behalf in land, in water, in air, in the fires that light free cities? Who says payment is needed still? Who won't forget a single one of your names in the world's silence? Reopened slag heaps easily absorb the sun and time. The truth has been sought so long and is rising in the east, in my language. Let it be that every month, ever in the name of love, 7 of our lives come to an end. All that matters is life won't end for the girl from Pivnichny. And I found that striking because she's sort of, this imaginary someone that is supposed to reconcile everything, that's supposed to remember absolutely every single lost person and living person, is sort of absent, right? There's like an absent God in the world. And in place of that omniscient presence, all we can do is like hold on to one image of one girl wearing pink. And that has to stand in for everybody who's been killed, even though she survives. And there's this kind of imbalance that I think she's drawing attention to. And I think it's a similar imbalance that we find in maybe that Adorno found, right? In the idea of attempting to use art to memorialize something horrific, that it's really never enough. And yet we do it anyway. So I guess that, that might lead to some questions about, how one makes art now about a war that has been, for some, supplanted by other more recent wars.
Wow, you're making me, all of you are making me excited about making the second version of this, which is, this present tense poems about the real world and new ways of writing, naive ways of writing, writing on Facebook, writing on Instagram, writing into their cell phone. That's very exciting to me. So I hope the money's raised for it so I can do it.
I think that what the discussion is going in this very interesting direction, the difference, and what Anna already alluded at the very beginning, the difference between responsive poetry, the poetry of witness that Amelia's work and that Anna has mentioned, and the poetry from a distance, which is what this film is about, the kind of second, third generation, or I don't know whether all of the poets have any connection with the experience of the Holocaust, or so I wonder whether you could talk about that difference, but also when poets writing from that distance, whether there is a line, where there is a line between dealing with that sort of intergenerational trauma, or perhaps the distance and the risk of appropriating that historical past suffering for the poetry of now.
One thing I think it might be helpful is a quick, I'll get to that, a little quick discussion about Holocaust films and as a genre. But in this film, you'll know that there is a poem, a found poem, found in a vase, a clay vase in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's an amazing poem because when I cut the film, so I've heard it 1,000 times. It's like literally in the cells in my brain. And I can tell you one thing, there's no way anyone could have written that poem without staring at their own oblivion, death. There's no way those words could have been written by anyone outside of that extremely highly charged crucible of looking at their own extinction. So we have poems that are inside of the Holocaust by someone who's literally dying. As we have the old man Fiden, who talks about how he used to outwit the guards and kind of an experiential day-to-day. And then we have people like Marx, the young woman who someone quoted before, who wrote a very abstract, modernist, expressionist poem. And I think she's, in her early 40s. And it's about her own experience of what it must have been like. So all of those poems are represented. Now, a little thing I think that's kind of missing in the conversation, I briefly want to state in a few sentences. There's this thing called Holocaust films. And, many of them, it took like 30 or 40 years where serious film, maybe in the 70s or 80s, where serious films about the Holocaust, either first-person films about people who were still alive and in the camps, their children who made films, and of course, a couple of masterpieces, like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which was a long discussion about what he achieved in that film. But if one could boil all of the work down, it was like saying, hey, this existed, and here are the details. It's much more than that. But that's what those poems were. So for me, I had no interest in making another one of those films. I think we've moved beyond that time. And so that's why I wanted to make a subjective film that would deal with subjective realities of that whole inexpressible event called the Holocaust. So I just want to differentiate where this film falls in this group of films called Holocaust films. And I think we're moving into a new zone just for the fact that literally no one is very soon going to be left alive who was in that. So it's another period. And it also has to do with my own lifelong interest in cinema and text, or voiceover. It's commonly called voiceover, where you have imagery running and then you have voiceover over it. That voiceover could be a monologue by an actor, or it could be a dream, or it could be literally a poem. There's a Russian filmmaker named Tarkovsky, and he used his father's poetry, Arseny Tarkovsky, and it's absolutely exquisite. The French filmmaker Agnes Varda, American filmmaker Terrence Malick, you'll often see him going on long sequences where we hear this very elevated language over thematic thing.
Can I just interrupt you to ask you about that for a moment? Because I recognize the Tarkovsky especially in the Ceylon passage. You had the Ceylon voiceover and then chose to have this sort of cave with people in it. And then there also was sound. And to me, it was very, very similar to a passage in Stalker where they're in the zone and they're exploring a sort of space with water. And there's this very similar dripping. And I'm wondering, I think it struck me as I was watching that passage, what you were doing was creating a sort of Tarkovsky in response to the poem in film, which is a really hard thing to do. It's, how do you turn a poem into a film? A poem is a very linguistic genre. A film has all these other things going on. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about it. Was that a direct citation? Or is it just more of a sort of, well, this is the genre that I'm working within?
Well, that's a great question. It's a bit of a discussion, but essentially what I'm trying to do is invite the viewer inside the experience of the poem. They're sitting in a dark theater. It's really, we use the term now, virtual reality. Put on a headset, go into some zone. Well, cinema was the virtual reality of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, can you imagine being in Russia in 1915 and going into a theater, a dark theater, and sitting down and this image is whirling in front of you? I mean, so so using various techniques, sensual, textural, sound design, I call them sound beds, where I'm putting all of this stuff that isn't sometimes not related at all to the image, but sound, since we're so being inundated by a tsunami of images every second in this culture, I find sound way more important. It's like a superhighway into someone's subconscious. And then they start, and the imagery is there just to allow them freedom. They're not being, that's what's wrong with television. Television is constantly loading us with, someone's talking about an apple, the guy shows an apple. I mean, what's left for you to do? And cinema, to me, the best cinema is allowed. The cinema is not taking place so much on the screen, but that little screen inside here, if it is inside here, a lot of the conversations about where consciousness is, but is there a little movie screen in the head? And that's what I'm trying to do, is build cinematic, textural, sound design sequences where I'm not force feeding the audience with stuff they have to feel. They have to feel. They're getting material and they have to go in and, much like a dream, start feeling and thinking and embracing what's there in terms of as if they were there. Because that, to me, is it's virtual reality. It's very, very profound, because that's what a poem does. I mean, poetry to me is very close to cinema. Very close to cinema. I have a new book which is going to be published in a few months, and they're called Cine Poems. And I have a little text in the front, and I just say, these are poems that could never be produced, but they're extremely cinematic. I mean, they have a rhythm, they have an imagery going by, and it's this marriage of and compression of ideas and instincts. And I mean, was there something before the word,
Mhm. Can I ask perhaps a question, Richard, about the way in which this construction of a virtual reality works in the specific case of a movie that has the Holocaust as its object? And this, of course, relates also to what you were saying earlier about the genre of Holocaust movies, because in a sense, it strikes me that it's one thing if in Mirror, Tarkovsky's Mirror, when Arseni's poem is cited at length, there's this beautiful sequence, this shot onto the, if I remember correctly, onto the countryside through the window. It's all the autobiographical memories of the narrator Tarkovsky, and we can put it in question, we can believe it, we can put in question whether he himself is intending to narrate it accurately. But there is a tradition, at least in discourse about the Holocaust, a centrality of the document and the documentary evidence that it's at least complex to think about moving away from in ways that will not give rise to suspicion. So I'm just curious about the way in which you see what you're describing, your forms of art making, as relating to the specific object of this movie.
Well, it's interesting to talk always with film about budgets, because, unlike painting, not sitting here in my pajamas painting, I mean, it requires people, it requires cameras, it requires lighting and assistance and blah, blah, blah. And the film had almost no money. I kind of made it on my own, a handmade film, until the reviewer, the former New Yorker reviewer, feminist reviewer, what's her name? It slipped my mind right now. She saw the film and was able to go to Molly Haskell, was able to go to a foundation that was closing, and we were able to get some money. So my original vision of the film was much more involved. So all of the, like for instance, the Salon film was going to be, the last film by the Israeli poet, the
Yeah.
very
Yehuda Amichai?
Amachai. If you really read between the lines in that poem, he meets ancestors that are beautiful children, and they're like 3 feet, they're children, but they're older than he is. It's very much like that idea of bringing the dead back to life. And it's a journey. And so I have this very sophisticated thing where I'm going to have the protagonist, the poet, walking through this place, this big place that was evocative to memory and the space that he was in. And he sees all of his ancestors standing about in translucent figures, like that you can almost see through them. I actually know how to do that now on a program called Da Vinci, where I can turn people into ghosts. And well, that costs money. That's a big day. That's a big shoot. So we ended up doing just a very simple performance of a wonderful actor who, by the way, is going to play Jesus Christ in Terrence Malick's new film, the most wonderful actor. And he basically just walks around near the Hudson River, and it's kind of profound. I mean, we even shot, the film, I'm getting off topic here, so let me get back to your question. What could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, sorry, it was not supremely clear. The question is, how does the virtual reality making or producing that you're describing work as intent on relate to the privileged status of the document and of documentary evidence, at least traditionally, in discourse about the Holocaust?
Yeah, well, I didn't feel a lot of pressure, if that's what you're saying, about, there's a famous quote about all facts are lies, all stories are true, by Ben Shahn, the painter. That's where I was sort of at. There wasn't a lot to preserve because I was just dealing with poems, and they're highly subjective. And anything in the film, I think, I don't feel embarrassed or that I lied in any way in any part of the film. And I felt that, in creating any subjective or indeterminacy in the poetry of the cinema, it was all there in service of what I found, and that's all I can work from, of the truth of the poem. I didn't have any command to deliver facts accurately. There's nothing in the film like that. It wasn't, a film about whatever, things that required very specific. It wasn't a film about, for instance, some mechanistic story about the design of the German death camps. The specifics, the money spent, how it was spent, how it unfolded. That's another film.
Yeah. May I ask another question? Because this brings up something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that is, what is the role of not only the artist, but the academic, the scholar, the person that's working in the world of arts, whether as a researcher or a practitioner. What is our role in a moment when post-truth is a very real phenomenon and is, in some senses, a very real threat? And I find myself thinking about my own field very critically, because I, on the one hand, believe that there are truths that collide with one another because of different subjectivities. But on the other hand, just as a reader, the art that I'm drawn to is art that that does speak to something that feels very true with a small t, something that could be uncovered with, science or investigative journalism. It's not that the artistic job is to do that investigation, but how do you talk about expressing the emotions from a very real experience that people in the world have attempted to deny without also talking about the truth of that fact, like the actual factual investigative truth of that fact? And it's a difficult, I think it's a question for all of literature right now. And I'll add that I think that's one of the reasons that so many poets from war zones have turned to very documentary poetry, because of the desire to say, here's this thing and it's real, and now let's talk about the response to it.
I could see that. That to me is a question that's its answer in a certain way. I mean, I'm going to have to meditate on that and think about how to address that if this next film is made. I mean, on a very simple level, you asked, how can academic help? And I would say both of you, academics, all of you, because of your lifelong deep involvement in this, you're almost like my director, and it would be great if we get this thing, maybe you can help as a consultant to deepen, not only make an obvious suggestion, like, check this out, this poem is incredible, but help me contextualize the bigger, deeper questions around approaching this. I don't want to make After again. I want to, because it's a different film. It's a different film when you have poets who exist now talking about then. It's a different film, and it has to have a different form, like the poem that was mentioned earlier, and the Ukrainian stuff that was mentioned earlier. I need to think and consider deeply the nature of the beast beyond the poems and the suggestion of the poems. What you just brought up is a huge thing, and a very interesting thing that I've been thinking a lot about now that somehow we've lost touch with science and facts. The famous quote with Moynihan, you can have your opinions, but you can't have your facts. You're not entitled to facts. There are things that are facts, or there used to be. So it's really interesting. And then this, like you were saying, this coming together of subjective information and what's around those. Because there's little bits of it in the film that are very actually that marriage of subjective. All poetry is like putting too much garlic in a meal. It's just garlic. You forget what's on the garlic. The fish and even little bits of information that are expository. Like in the film, there's a little paragraph about this clay pot that was found under the ground in the excavation of the Warsaw Ghetto. That's only 3.5 sentences, but there's something about that sets up other things, I don't know.
Anna?
Can I follow up on one of the questions you just raised, Richard, and saying, like, what can academics do to direct kind of some of the, or influence or impact some of the artistic production? So I was thinking that one major theme in your film was the theme of silence. And it's interesting how the topic of silence is so prominent in the film that talks about poetry, where people actually articulate words. And I understand exactly where it's coming from, because there's so much of aftermath of violence that covered with secrets, with lies, with impossibility of telling the truth, or impossibility to relating what happened. And the moments when you have like a daughter and a mother, or younger generation, older generation, talking poetry to each other, and it means different things for all of them. I think these are important moments, and these are also moments of poetry is privilege. It's kind of is taken for granted, for example, in the United States or in Canada, where I am, that people talk about Holocaust, that there are films about Holocaust, there's stories, and there are Holocaust survivors who go and talk in schools or at universities about their experiences. But, so many of those Holocaust survivors who lived in the Soviet Union, or to some extent also in Poland, they did not talk about those experiences at all, because it was not even like part of culture, but some places it was very dangerous. One could get arrested for revealing that they survived the war under the German occupation. All Soviet Holocaust survivors from Vilna Ghetto, for example, were investigated for their belonging to Zionist parties, and those who were found guilty was sent to Soviet Gulag. Avrom Sutskever, a poet from Vilna Ghetto, and Abba Kovner, another poet from Vilna Ghetto, went to Israel, created the narrative of Holocaust memory there. Their comrades, their friends from Vilna Ghetto, also poets, also belonging to the same groups, went to Soviet Gulag and never talked about those experiences up until 1989. So I was thinking as watching the film is that there are silences, there are impossibilities of talking, but there's also a privilege of being able to transmit the memory, privilege of thinking about the past in poetic form and speaking about this as much as possible. So I'm curious where you see this juxtaposition between silence and the privilege to break that silence, I guess, with poetry that appears later in the aftermath. Maybe this is where our friend Adorno will be much more applicable, right, to the poetry that's being created in a meaningful way.
Well, I think you're hitting on something. There's not only, I hope it doesn't occur in this country, but the most obvious, like, political oppression of having a voice, like the one story you just mentioned of being in Vilna and ending up in some gulag somewhere. But I noticed right now, there is like an incredible narrowing of the American mind in all the arts, certainly in cinema. Cinema's been taken over by Marvel Comics. To even get an audience, a thoughtful audience, to deal with this, there's another kind of silencing going on that is not a guy knocking on your door with a gun and saying, "Are you a member of the?" It's another kind of narrowing of the mind. So, am I? It's just a response. I'm not. Is there?
Like in a sense, yes, but that's a whole separate story. And again, it's unfolding. I'm still waiting for poetry about that in English to appear and manner. But I'm just thinking that there are books about second generation survivors, third generation survivors, right? In United States and Western Hemisphere, there's not a single book about trajectories, for example, of Soviet Holocaust survivors, like not one. Forget the poetry, forget art, and actually people do forget that. But once you identify who these people are, finding their voices and how they address the past, the only way to do it in a meaningful way is to look for the art that they created. Filmmakers kind of putting in between lines stories of ghettos, or screenwriters putting little things about memories based on their parents. Like, I don't know, Vasily Grossman writing this really important novel, Life and Fate, right? In the 60s, putting a character in who loses his mother in Berdichev Ghetto, and writing a letter from that mother from Berdichev Ghetto. It's not based on his own story. It's informed by it, but it's not what happened to his mother, because obviously he never got a letter from her. But art is responding to the lack of memory and to the lack of historical information available to people. I think this is where artists and scholars can collaborate in a very productive way.
Yeah. This on a different topic. just because I mentioned his name, I find this story incredible. Gezer Rorik, who is playing Jesus in the Terrence Malick movie, which will come out one of these days. Malick is known for spending years in the edit room. Long story short, he was a kid in Budapest who lost his entire family in Auschwitz. And he's a model, he's a rock star, he's like a handsome young guy. And it just hits him one day, I've got to go to Auschwitz. I mean, I told the story in the film. And he goes up there. This is before it became like a tourist site. And he walks by the babushka at the front gate and says, "Can I go in there?" She goes, "Oh, go in there. What do I care?" He goes in there and stays there for a month until he is somehow wanting to reconnect with the entire family that he's lost. And he crawls into, and the lights go out all of a sudden. You know how in Europe, trying to save money, the lights in the buildings go out. And I said, "Weren't you terrified? I mean, seeing ghosts, etc." He said, "No. I mean, he crawled in to this thing, and there were scratches on the wall, and it said in Yiddish the phrase for God,
Echad.
Echad." And he said, in Yiddish, there's no punctuation. So does it mean, is God here, even here? Or even here, there's God? And somehow after that, he became a religious Jew. Came back to America, like very interesting story. But to go into this place of absolute hell and stay there for a month alone with a flashlight, to me, is remarkable.
So as we're wrapping up, I just wanted to sort of turn to the end of your film and then connect to some of the points that were made here by Amelia and Anna. So towards the end of the film, Richard, you're gesturing to suffering beyond the Jewish suffering, beyond the Holocaust, right? At the end, the images flashing during credits are gesturing to other wars and other trauma and crisis and destruction. But the film doesn't make those connections and the thing. There's, I think, only one artist who brings in the Hiroshima and Rwanda in the process, but really it doesn't. It sort of stays situated in the Holocaust and the trauma. So I wonder whether we could sort of close, and especially since both Amelia's book, Songs in the Dark Times, connects how Jewish poets were making these connections with the suffering of others through the lens of Jewish suffering. And I know, Anna, you have thought about and done some work on those connections beyond both across generations, but across also different groups. So I wonder whether we could talk about the art and poetry and making these connections, this moment. Again, as we all were watching this film, we're thinking about all that destruction that's happening as we speak, and what kind of role and what poetry can do, and even thinking about the Holocaust and Jewish poetry can do for making these connections across other forms of suffering.
Well, it's like Alicia Ostreicher said in the Talmud, if you save one life, it's like you save the whole world. And, making this film, I did not want to die. First of all, much of this film was made long before this tumultuous, conflicting thing that's happening all over the world, and certainly in Israel. And I didn't want to dive into those waters because it's too big of a film, and I just didn't want to go there. However, I was very concerned that this would seem like some kind of ham-fisted film that would not, or somehow be very narrow and not able to see the, like you say, the global suffering, the worldwide thing, and not make it just an exclusive thing to the Holocaust. So that was a concern. There's a beautiful line in the film by Glaser again, who's kind of a hero of mine. He says in the film, the most generous thing, he's there, he is living in this darkened concentration camp. And he realizes, and he says, well, this is what we do. This is what we do. Meaning, this is what humanity is capable of. And everybody is capable of that, those mistakes made in the name of life, and some kind of righteous thing, I know, and it gets very, very complicated very quickly. But all I can say is I thought about all of those issues. There are no good answer. I just tried, and a lot of the film, I wouldn't want to make that film, like, somehow. But maybe that's why I think it's nice that the film may be in a series, because now we then step out of something that happened in the past, the greatest probably the most horrendous thing in human history. And now we are at this hinge of history where so much is going on. And now I can move around and get out of just the Shoah and get into the present tense everywhere. So that in a series, like you said, which I liked a lot, and that's what I clung to, is that the Holocaust was a model, a horrific model of the whole state of who we are and what we do. As Glaser said, this is what we do.
Anna, Amelia?
I think there are a lot of ways to kind of develop thinking about this. One is to not just to say, okay, Holocaust is a model for all the violence, but instead to say the trauma from violence lasts for so long. And I think that's one of the most powerful messages that I got, at least from the film, that it's 80 years after, and the emotion that the violence, the memory of violence provokes, it doesn't go away, and it just moves on from one generation to another. And every person who, like, they express it differently, but they cry, and it's a genuine tears, and the viewers also cannot help but be impacted by the power of these words. And another thought I had about comparison of what kind of poetry emerges in different kinds of contexts of violence. It's astonishing how so many tropes of that are so similar. So, the trope of blood flowing down the streets. No matter where the war happens, we see the blood flowing the streets. There's also narrative of God or people not caring about what's happening. If we start looking into the poetry created in sites of violence right now, this is it. This is it. People don't care that we're being killed. Please, somebody tell our story. We see it in Holocaust. We see it right now, and with ways to communicate with each other, like social media and the accessibility of our phones and stuff like this. How is that sedation the world doesn't know and the world doesn't care? How is that still relevant, right? So interesting to think about that. Also, amateur poets, amateur people, everyday people becoming poets because there's no other choice. The doctor who Amelia cited, right, she was not a poet, I don't think, before the war. Oh, maybe she was, and I'm making it up. I don't know. But maybe not a professional poet, right? So turning to poetry because there's no other choice. And what it is about human beings that have to turn to poetic word if they need to say what they need to say when they need to say it. So I think these are questions that are sadly universal. And there's one way to look at that memory, and there's another way to look, and it definitely keeps us thinking about what's happening right now and what happened in the past and how long the impact of that will last.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anna just put that really beautifully, that it really is, the multi-generational trauma of the Holocaust is captured really beautifully. And I think whenever you talk about trauma, you're talking about something that's universal and specific. And this version of the Holocaust is perhaps a specific narrative that is told by some children of some survivors. I see this as something that is translatable, but also, also specific, also unique. And there's a wonderful translator named Lena Mounzer. I was just sharing her essay with Anna before we started today, she translates Syrian literature and including poetry into English. And she talks about how she struggles because she doesn't have the same visceral reaction to the English word for an Arabic original as she does in the Arabic original, because sometimes it means a bomb is coming or something very, very, very physical. And I think the purpose of art is to get just a hint of that physicality across. And then, of course, if the audience can be broader than the most obvious community, then connections can start to be made between, horrific experiences, between experiences of being a victim and being a perpetrator, and so on and so forth. So perhaps the goal of art also always has to look at two audiences at once, or multiple audiences at once.
I was looking for a 19-year-old, male or female, in a taxi cab, 3 a.m., going from club to club, reading his or her poem into her cell phone, bouncing around in the cab. Like, that reminded me of what you said. So much of like delivering the art is the context. Everyone at 3 a.m. has bounced around in a cab. Somehow that brings the experience that much closer, and it delivers the poem that might never have been read or transferred to anyone else. But I was looking for that person to do the very thing you just said, and I couldn't find them. But anyhow.
There is as questions begin to come into the Q&A box here, and we invite people to write them. And there's a question that comes from Professor Larry Stempel at Fordham about the film's engagement with Adorno's position and its implications, in particular from the angle of language. Professor Stempel asks if Adorno really meant all poetry, or poetry in the language in which he made a statement, which is the very language whose barbarization worked, he writes, to enable the barbarism or the barbary for which Auschwitz became the emblem. And he says that in the film, the comments preceding the reading of Celan's Todesfuge begin to hint at this. And it's in fact, it's a question that I in a sense, I had also had having to do. I think at some point, Sabrina Ora Mark speaks of the mother language and the murder language in reference to Celan, and I was thinking about how, in a sense, throughout Jewish history, all languages are murder languages, have historically been the languages, among other things, of people who were perpetrators of violence in the communities from which the poets themselves that express themselves in those same languages came. So is there something about, as it relates to this question, something about the German language or languages that have been particularly compromised with violent systems that makes them less viable means of poetic expression? And
I barely speak German, so I can't speak on that. I will speak about, since I cut all of these films and have lived, Marx's poem, I've must have heard 500 times. I just love it. I just love it. And it's the most out there poem in the piece. She's a real postmodernist. I don't know what she is to this day exactly talking about. And that's the ultimate compliment, for poems, is she created such an indeterminacy that I'm still up in that poised realm trying to land with her, but I feel it. I mean, she talks about this boy she's with who loses all his teeth. I mean, these kind of subjective fragments about ultraviolence. So she, in fact, what I'm trying to say is she, in fact, created her own language, even though she made some beautiful comments about Celan reworking German, the people who killed his entire family. She actually, I mean, if you really study her poem, about all the other, I mean, there's some poems in there that are very prose-like and are kind of the thing I wrote in there about my father, being 18 years old and going from Omaha Beach to a concentration camp as an American soldier. I mean, that's almost like a prose piece. It's kind of embarrassing. It tells the facts of a, 18-year-old kid from New Jersey walking into a concentration camp. It's prose. It's not poetry on that level. And I love Marx's work. I wish I could write so well. I don't know. So yeah, I love which I love how quickly and clearly she introduced Celan and what he was actually trying to do, again, the role of poetry is to get outside the utilitarian realm.
Amelia and Anna, one last sort of thoughts, either on this particular question or the film, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you for promoting poetry in your film. I realized that wasn't the purpose. I realized it wasn't the purpose to promote poetry, but you have celebrated it in in important ways, and I appreciate your highlighting that.
Yeah, I think the poets did a good job. Because I would ask them, I say, what's the point? I mean, why poetry? I don't know exactly what I said. It didn't sound quite so reductive, but
I would also say thank you for allowing them to speak their languages. It was such a treat to hear poetry in the language that it was written, with subtitles. Filmmakers don't always do this for the audience, and it was wonderful to be able to
music. It's music.
Yeah.
That thing that Geza wrote about it's just, it's music. So, well, thank you both. And thank all of you for being so kind and to watch the film. The film is actually had some very rough beginnings, I think, because of the political situation going on in the world. And now it's starting to really somehow break through, people not wanting to touch it. And maybe there's, anti-Semitism, other things, also the narrowing again of audiences, but it received from Roger Ebert, one of the best films of 24, lots of great reviews, and it just got a very good distribution from a very good company.
Well, we're very honored to have been part of the pre-big distribution process, and I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity, and Amelia and Anna, thank you so much for your time, and Emmanuel, thank you for co-hosting this conversation, and I want to thank the audience, and also the member of our advisory board, Hadassah Weiner, who suggested that we bring the film to Fordham. So thank you all, and we hope you'll join us for other programs. Thank you.
Janet Kirshheimer for her bringing this all together.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.